Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. Today, in this explainer, we're going to unpack one of the most dizzying, dramatic, and honestly heartbreaking character arcs in all of human history. We're looking at the tragic fall of Napoleon Bonaparte. We're going to trace his historic rise to just absolute unmatched power across Europe, and then follow that incredibly rapid, devastatingly lonely fall that came right after. It's a story of military genius, sure, but more importantly, it's a masterclass in human hubris and the shocking betrayals that happen when transactional loyalty finally runs out. So, let's get right into it.
Okay, let's just look at this stark contrast right off the bat. I mean, on one hand, you have the undisputed master of Europe, a guy so incredibly powerful he was literally distributing crowns to his family members, and on the other hand, just a few short years later, he's an exiled prisoner, dying completely alone on a desolate rock. Starting here at his absolute peak is really the only way we can understand just how incredibly far the Emperor of Europe ultimately fell.
Section 1. The Peak of Glory. Master of the Continent.
So, to really set the stage here, let's rewind to the year 1810. Napoleon's empire was rivaling the legendary days of Charlemagne, and his word was absolute law. He had crushed massive coalitions, reshaped the map of the world with an iron will, and he wasn't just conquering territories anymore. He was handing out entire European kingdoms. We're talking Italy, Naples, Spain, Westphalia, Bavaria, Saxony, giving them to his brothers, relatives, and top generals like they were personal gifts. He pulled these men up from nothing and placed his own bloodline on the thrones of the oldest nations in Europe. It was a level of dominance that was completely unprecedented.
Moving into Section 2, the military betrayals, the sting of ingratitude.
Now, what's fascinating is that elevating his inner circle came with a massive hidden cost. The very men he had showered with insane wealth, grand titles, and these huge estates, well, they had grown way too comfortable. That hunger that won them the empire in the first place was just gone. And you can clearly see Napoleon's growing, desperate frustration in his own words to them. He said, "You are men of wealth and importance. You take no pleasure except in staying in your beautiful house in Paris." He realized that his closest marshals, guys like Berthier and Murat, had completely lost their fighting spirit. When the massive coalitions of Europe started marching against France, these generals basically decided they didn't want to risk their lives or their new fortunes on the battlefield anymore.
And that leads us right to this incredibly heartbreaking mutiny. By 1814, at Fontainebleau, the ultimate betrayal went down. The very men Napoleon had raised from the mud to the absolute highest echelons of European aristocracy bluntly and callously refused to follow his orders. Marshal Ney coldly declared, "The army will not obey." And Marshal MacDonald? He told him straight to his face, "We have had enough." The great conqueror who had outsmarted entire nations was finally cornered and forced to abdicate, not by enemy armies, but by his own exhausted, ungrateful inner circle.
Section 3. The Waterloo Disaster. Errors and Treason.
So, even after his first exile, Napoleon actually comes back, but the unraveling of his military machine just kept going. His strategic genius was definitely still intact, but it was completely undone by fatal, catastrophic failures from his subordinates. Marshal Marmont, a man Napoleon deeply trusted, committed shocking treason by aligning with the enemy. And then at the Battle of Waterloo itself, Marshal Grouchy's catastrophic battlefield blunder of failing to march to the sound of the guns fundamentally ruined Napoleon's entire strategy from the inside out.
But, as absolutely devastating as it is to be betrayed by your brothers in arms on the battlefield, an even more shocking heartbreak was waiting for him in his personal life. While his entire empire collapsed around him, we really have to ask, where was his beloved wife during his absolute darkest hour?
Which brings us to Section 4. A wife's shocking betrayal, the Austrian deception. You see, to secure a royal bloodline, Napoleon had actually divorced his first wife Josephine out of this desperate need to solidify his new empire. He married Marie-Louise, a young Austrian princess, truly believing this union would secure peace with Austria and give him the dynasty he was craving. But her loyalty, it completely vanished the second the tide turned. If you look at his private letters, you can just feel his desperation. He writes, "I hope your health allows you to bear this. You can always depend on me." This brilliant military mind, this terrifying conqueror, was literally reduced to begging for her presence and support, genuinely believing she would come to him in exile as his whole world burned down.
But the agonizing reality here is that while Napoleon was pacing the floors, anxiously waiting for his wife to join him in exile, she had completely different plans. Marie-Louise wasn't coming. Actually, she was actively being seduced by a one-eyed Austrian general, Count Neipperg. So while Napoleon is waiting for his family, the mother of his child essentially started acting like a hostile enemy to France, openly rejoicing at the victories of the Allied forces against her own husband.
And man, the cruelty really didn't stop there. Marie-Louise not only abandoned him for another man, but she made sure that his beloved son, the King of Rome, his ultimate hope, and literally his entire reason for building this dynasty in the first place, was permanently kept away from him in Vienna. Napoleon would never see his son again. It's this profound, piercing, personal tragedy that completely broke the spirit of a man who no army could previously break.
Section 5. Lonely Exile and Legacy. The Prisoner of St. Helena.
The sheer weight of those military mutinies, combined with this massive spousal betrayal, just pushed Napoleon into a dark abyss. Sources actually note it even briefly drove the great conqueror to contemplate suicide. The descent was just relentless chaos. I mean, look at the dizzying speed of this timeline. In 1814, he's forced to abdicate. Then there's this frantic glimmer of hope in early 1815 when he returns for the 100 days, but that's followed immediately by the total disaster of Waterloo. And finally, by late 1815, his permanent exile. It is a breathtakingly rapid fall from grace.
And his ultimate destination? He was exiled to the remote, unforgiving, rocky island of St. Helena, way out in the middle of the South Atlantic. He was completely stripped of his grand titles, totally isolated from his beloved son, abandoned by his wife, and betrayed by the very generals he had made rich. The guy who used to distribute entire nations to his friends was left to die on a tiny rock utterly alone.
So, I want to leave you all with this final thought to chew on. Was Napoleon Bonaparte just a ruthless conqueror who finally met his inevitable downfall? Or, when you look at the heartbreaking treason of his closest generals and the cruel deception of his own wife, was he ultimately a tragic victim of the very people he raised to power? The contradictions of his legacy really show us that absolute power very often leads to absolute isolation. If you want to keep exploring the incredible, dramatic complexities of history with us, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more deep dives just like this one. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.